Next up, we have 4.02, the financial forecast. And Ms. Marshall, will you talk to us about this, please?
Yes. Thank you, President Meyer, members of the board. There we go. So we are updating the forecast today, September 22nd, 2025. It is now known as a financial forecast, not a 5-year forecast, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The purpose of the forecast, it's a valuable long-range planning tool. It serves as the basis for the district to be able to sign the 412 certificate, which is required for all long-term contracts, appropriation measures, bargaining agreements, salary schedules, or anything like that. And it also provides a method for the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce and the Ohio Auditor of State to identify districts headed towards financial difficulties. And we've talked about some of those things in the past that they look at in previous presentations, so I won't bore you with all that right now. We had some new requirements for the financial forecast under House Bill 96, which was the state's most recent budget bill. So no longer is it a 5-year forecast. We now file a current year budget plus a 3-year projection no later than October 15th for this year, fiscal year 2026. And then next year, that will be by August the 31st of 2026. And then we come back and update projections no later than the end of February each year with the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. Previously, we were doing the initial forecast at the end of November and updating it by the end of May. So this is a big change with the timing of when the forecast is done. We will continue to present 5 years to the Board of Education and district leadership in order to adequately plan. We believe that 5 years is required in order to be able to adequately plan for the future. And we have a lot of multi-year contracts that span a 5-year period in order to have some cost savings for the district. 3 years actual information is also included for historical purposes, and that will continue to be the case. The forecast includes the general fund only, so that's the district's general operating fund. And I like to mention that it's really in 3 parts. It has revenues, expenditures, and then balances and reserves. Just a reminder that the school district's fiscal year runs from July 1st through June 30th.
Nicole, not to interrupt you, but you might want to move your microphone up a little,
I'm
especially
sorry.
with the noise
I felt
from
like
the
I was
storm.
being very loud.
With the rain, I
is
think
very
it's a little
loud,
hard to
though.
hear you. Thanks.
Challenges with pretty much every forecast, but especially this forecast. We are always dealing with legislative changes. State funding has been a big issue. We've done a lot of advocacy for that over this past biennium budget cycle. And federal funding, it has been a recent unknown for us. And this forecast is developed based on the best information that we have available to us today. Those estimates will most definitely change going forward as information changes, but this is what we have today to work with. This is a picture of all revenues. I've highlighted year 2030 because that's not technically part of the financial forecast, but we're presenting it today so that we can adequately plan. Fiscal year 2026, we have funding reduced and further reductions are expected in the years going out. The updated budget bill for school funding still included funding based on what it cost to educate students in 2022. It continues to update our local wealth factors, which make our community look wealthier, which is increasing our local share in that calculation. There's also a new base funding supplement and performance supplement payments that are included in 26 and 27. And so we won't have updated payment reports for a while from the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce, but we do have a calculator that we're using for these estimates. We had a one-time transfer in. I just want to highlight this because it looks a little like an anomaly on the forecasted revenues in 2025. That was part of, we had transferred money out into a capital projects fund to combine with the bond issue that was on the ballot last November to be a no new millage. When last November's ballot issue wasn't successful, we transferred that money back into the general operating fund because we're seeing deficit spending and we didn't get additional operating dollars as part of that. So that is showing as a revenue, but it's not really a revenue for the general fund. Revenue uncertainty. State funding continues to be extremely unstable and uncertain. Going back all the way to 2020, we had significant cuts made in 2020 and 2021. We had a new funding formula that came into play in 2022 and 2023 that wasn't fully funded. The funding formula continued in 24 and 25, still not fully funded. Our funding was significantly reduced in fiscal year 25 compared to fiscal year 24. We're now in fiscal year 26, if anybody's keeping track. Funding formula for 26 and 27 continues to use the old outdated costs, the 2022 costs, and update those local wealth factors, increasing our local share. And this forecast also includes new biennium budgets for 28 and 29, and then again for 2030 and 31. Homestead and rollback reimbursements continue to be up for debate with the legislature. The state picks up a portion of property taxes for senior citizens and disabled residents for homestead exemptions, and the schools are reimbursed for that. And then there was a reimbursement and exemption back that went away for all new levies after 2013 for residential properties and people who lived in that property, so owner-occupied properties. We continue to see reimbursement from the state for those exemptions, but it is continually coming up for debate about whether the state is going to continue to reimburse schools for those dollars. Along with property taxes, that continues to be a topic of conversation with the state legislature. We're very thankful to the governor for vetoing some very dangerous provisions that he vetoed as part of the biennium budget that would have decimated school districts around the state, not just ours. The governor's work group, he's created a work group. They're currently working on some property tax reform, and they're meeting now. I think they're supposed to have their report out by the end of next week, maybe? In addition to that, there's several bills. Last time I counted, it was 17 pending that are being debated by the current General Assembly, the 136th, that would affect property taxes in some ways. When we talk about the decreased state share of funding, so the state looks at our local community, they look at our local property wealth and our resident income, and they compare us to the other 610 public schools around the state. And as we continue to look wealthier as a community, the state says that our community should pay more towards the cost of educating students. In 2021, our state share was 43%. Today, it's about 18%. We're in fiscal year 26. By next year, we're estimated to be around 11% based on the current biennium budget. When I talk about the instability of state funding, what I'm talking about is the state updating this calculation for that state share that makes our community look wealthier, but they're keeping those costs the same. They're saying, what does it cost to educate a student? And then what's the state share? What's the local share? This is a lot of numbers on a slide and a table here, so just kind of bear with me for a minute, if you will. I wanted to kind of highlight just how unstable this is for us. So from fiscal year 24 coming into fiscal year 25, both years used those 2022 cost inputs, but our state share calculation dropped by 7%. So as you can see on this slide, our total enrolled ADM, and I just want to mention, enrolled ADM for the purposes of our payment reports, counts students in fractional amounts. It doesn't include our preschool students. A half-day kindergarten student would be counted for like a half of a student. And as kids enroll and leave the district, it counts kids as fractional amounts. So our enrollment is around 14,600, our official enrollment count. But for the purposes of the payment report, it uses enrolled average daily membership numbers. So our total for the purposes of base funding from 24 to 25, looking at the June number 2 payments, and they update these twice a month for our payment reports, we gained about 99 students, and the calculated funding decreased by about $6.7 million. And then we have all of these categorical add-ons on top of that base cost. And so for special education, we gained about 148 students in that category, and the calculated funding decreased by over $700,000. And you can see what it looks like for the rest of those categories for funding. Now, this wasn't our ultimate funding because after this, the state did a whole calculation on we're only phasing in a portion of the overall funding formula. It got really complicated to put on a slide. So I just want to show, try to show what this looks like when we talk about how our school funding is unstable. This is something that we're dealing with constantly as the state continues to not update the funding formula appropriately with the appropriate inputs. So looking at our calculated state funding for fiscal year 26 versus 25, I know this is really hard to see, so I did this really cool Zoom thing. So you can see for fiscal year 25, which was our actual, we were at about 38.9 million. And this year, according to the calculator that we have available, again, I don't have updated payment reports, it's just an estimate, we're at about 37.6 million. And that was what was in the Legislative Services Commission's estimates that they did for the General Assembly when they were finalizing the state budget bill. So that's a reduction of about $1.3 million overall. That's revenues. Now looking at expenses, the district continues to see increases annually with inflation. We're all dealing with inflationary increases. This forecast includes the reductions that we've already made, and we'll talk some about those. And then it also includes a one-time transfer out as we're thinking about the instability of our funding that we get from the state and trying to make sure that we have programs and services in place without having to make significant cuts for our students and those programs. The board transferred out in order to appropriately reserve funds for certain resources, and we also reduced expenses out of the general fund as part of that transfer. And so just to highlight a good example of this, because you can see it in this line, like capital outlay, a lot of technology and things like that, we're basically zeroing that expense out of this general fund, and we're going to pay for it out of that other reserve fund that the board's created. And the reason why we took this approach is because as part of all of this conversation around the state budget and property taxes and what everything looks like, we had a lot of lawmakers that were suggesting the transfers. This is a quote from an ABC6 interview that aired on April the 28th. State Rep Dave Thomas, he's out of Ashtabula, says that districts can move money from their general funds into specific reserve accounts meant for something like a roof or a school bus. And he said you either should be reserving it towards some future purpose for the voter, or it shouldn't be in your account. These reserve accounts include termination benefits fund, which is basically to account for funds to pay for required severance payments. Under Ohio law, we are required to pay severance payments to our employees upon separation for leave that they've earned and accumulated that hasn't been used. And then also capital projects fund, and that's to help account for various items that we would need under capital projects that might include motor vehicles or anything of a fixed asset.
Yeah, Ms. Marshall, just because not everybody is in fund accounting every day.
Yes.
Thank
you.
So with the general fund, can you just give everyone just a quick overview of, I think it's probably pretty clear, but what that means, and that these other funds, like, we can't just go making them up, right?
Right. Yeah.
Would be
So
helpful,
we
thanks.
have very specific accounting funds that we can create and can have. The general operating fund is just that. It's our general fund. So anything, most of our property tax revenue that we get, the state funding, all of that goes into that. Our other funds are considered restricted funds. So it's revenues that are set aside and allocated for a specific purpose. The general account can be used to pay for anything that is a proper public purpose, just like the rest of our funds. But it doesn't have any restrictions on what those funds can be used on. If we want to pay for school buses out of the general fund, we can. If we want to pay for, to build a new building out of the general fund, we can. But this allows us to allocate funds for specific purposes. And as the lawmakers were talking, they feel like if we're paying for some of these things out of the general fund, let's take technology, for example, that's not being transparent to our taxpayers. and that we should have these dollars set aside in a reserve account so that everybody knows that we plan to pay for these things out of this reserve account for that specific purpose. And so that's the idea behind this, I think.
Thank you.
So austerity measures, we'll talk a little bit more about this during the work session, but what we looked at was rescinding that capital projects fund and transferring back the $30 million originally allocated for facilities projects that we had combined with the bond issue. We reduced fiscal year 2025 budgets by $4.8 million. We reduced current and projected budgets for curriculum and technology by over $2.4 million. We absorbed over 30 positions this school year, in this school year alone, for a savings of over 3.3 million, and that's an annual savings. And then we eliminated transfer out. We were setting aside money through transfers to the Permanent Improvement Fund for turf replacement to save up, and we eliminated that transfer out of the general fund. As we do with every forecast, we have a lot of uncertainty in our expenses and what those might look like. And I can't stress enough that these are estimates that we have today. But we continue to look at staffing needs, the educational needs of our students, the economy and inflation. State mandates are a real thing that happens pretty much every time we turn around. And then healthcare costs. You'll see tonight the board has a resolution to adopt our health insurance premiums, dental and vision as well. But we're looking at a 13.8% increase in our medical premiums because the cost of claims and cost of healthcare has just grown so much. And so we continue to keep an eye on all of those things. So this looks a little wonky. That's a technical term, by the way. So this shows our revenues and expenses during the forecast period. So we have fiscal year 23, 24, 25 actuals. The green line is our revenues for actuals, and then the projected are 26 through 30. And then the red line are our expenses. And then the blue bar is our unreserved ending fund balance for our general fund. We continue to see a gap in our revenues and expenses, and I do just want to highlight those peaks there are from those transfers that we talked about, not actual changes in revenues and expenses. And then we also had ESSER funds during this time that we were paying for some expenses that were normally paid out of our general fund. We were paying for them out of the ESSER funds, which were COVID relief dollars that we received during the COVID pandemic. And so all of those expenses have slowly been coming back to the general fund over that time. And so that included some of that as well. If I take out the transfers, because it looks a little noisy to me, and just look at revenues over expenses, when we talk about the district is operating in a deficit, what we're saying is that our revenues are not keeping up with inflation and the expenses that we have. And so this just is that same graph showing the difference between revenues and expenses year over year. So in 2025, our expenses exceeded our revenues by 8.3 million. In 2026, this year, we're projected to be around 12 million. And then next year, we're projected to be around 18 million. And that deficit continues to grow without additional revenue or significant reductions in expenses. And that is my forecast presentation.
Thank you. I know we've talked a little bit about this in the past, but for the purposes of this meeting tonight, I think it's important to remind ourselves about it. And I know there's been some conversations about the federal funding that we receive. We were lucky to be able to get that, after they froze it the first day before school started. Can you remind us what we've heard from our state reps about what they're thinking about for the federal funding too?
So we get around $8 million in federal funding, and that money is used for things like reading and math instruction, professional development for staff, supports for some of our students with specialized needs. And we are very concerned, you've probably heard the talk that if they shut down the U.S. Department of Education, they're going to send the money to the state in block grants. And in talking with one of our legislators recently, I specifically asked again, because this has come up multiple times, if we can count on getting that same amount of funding, because we have a lot of things that we are counting on paying for out of that money. And the answer was, let's just say, led me to believe that may not be the case. So just concerned, and I just shared if that money were to be diverted away from our public schools, that those would be additional revenue gaps that we would be facing in addition to the reduction we've seen in our state funding.
And in terms, thank you. And in terms of state funding, can you remind us how much we've been underfunded? I think you, in this slide, you've shown since 2022 or 2020. I know you've,
The state share,
yeah.
the state shares dropped, it would be 25% by this year. And then it's projected to drop another 7% next year, based on the current budget
And
that's been
then
approved.
Do you know that in the terms, I know you've told me this number before, but what is that in terms of millions?
So we're receiving about nearly $8 million less this year compared to what we were receiving in 2021.
And over the years, that's
Over the
added
years,
up
it
to
grows.
be,
It's over $45 million.
thank you, that's,
Yeah.
thank you.
Ms. Marshall, would you mind going back one slide to the revenues and revenues versus expenses? Yeah, so one of the things that I'm hoping you can just explain to people is when you look at those revenues and they look really flat, right? A lot of times people say, well, you know, my property was reassessed, my taxes went up, the schools must be getting a lot more money, but that green line is pretty darn flat. So can you just explain why that's the case?
So it's flat, one, because our state funding continues to be declining. We know what the state budget looks like for fiscal year 26 and 27. We have, so every 6 years, our properties are reappraised, a full reappraisal, and the last full reappraisal was done in 2023. And we've talked at length about that. You know, we're a House Bill 920 district, which means as on voted levies, as values go up, tax rates go down, so the revenue that the district receives remains relatively the same. We don't see a lot of growth on property taxes. We have a small portion, it's 3.8 mils of like around 39, 40 mils that we collect that's called inside millage set by the state constitution, and that never changes. So we see a little bit of growth from that. The other thing that we see growth from is new construction, if it's not been abated for economic development or something like that. So that's our opportunity to receive new growth on revenue is through new construction or that inside millage. So as state funding, so we have another update year for values coming in 2026. They reappraise every 6 years, do an update every third year in between. We're not projected to see a huge growth in the overall property tax because of that, because we don't have any new property tax levies on the horizon. And we know that it's only a small portion. We're actually seeing, when we talk about new construction, we're actually seeing the opposite of growth on revenue because of Board of Revision changes that happen. Right now, you know, when the county went back and did its mass reappraisal in 2023, how they valued some commercial properties, some of those businesses are coming back and saying, hey, wait a minute, my property lost value because of COVID and all these other things, and they're adjusting, which is a straight revenue loss to the district when those get adjusted down. And so it's something we keep an eye on, but that's why when we look at this going out, if we see growth in property taxes without a new levy, without a new property tax levy specifically, we don't really see a lot of growth enough to make that grow on that graph, especially when we have the state declining revenue on top of that.
Now, thank you. So just like to underscore that, the percentage of the share that the state's giving continues to drop. But I know it's really confusing, the difference, you know, when we talk about millage and inside mills and outside mills, the inside are the non-voted mills. It's about 1/10 of our millage right now
Yeah.
that's inside mills. So, for example, on someone's house, about a tenth of it is going to increase over time, right? It's because you're collecting a percentage on that tenth.
Yeah.
The other 90%, you're not collecting a percentage on, it's a capped dollar amount when you look across the
Yeah.
district. Now, individual taxpayers might see things go up or down, but as a district,
Yeah, as a district, we don't see growth on those voted mills because of that.
Mm.
But I think it's important to note that individually, you might see a difference in your taxes because your tax bill will change depending on how much your property value grew compared to the average. So, for example, the 2023 reappraisals in Franklin County, on average, residential values went up by 38%. And so what this means is that if your value grew by more than 38%, you likely saw an increase in your tax bill. If your value grew by less than 38%, you likely saw a decrease in your tax bill. And Franklin County said that 30% of people who own homes in our district actually saw a decrease in their tax bill because of the 2023 reappraisals. Now, that means 70% saw saw some of an increase or a lot of an increase, right? And it's just shifting who's paying that depending on how values changed. And I have a whole presentation on that. If
Yes,
anybody's
you
ever
do.
interested
It's a
in
good
seeing
one.
it. It's very confusing, and I think the whole conversation around property taxes, and I try to stress this to our lawmakers, is that schools have what's known as the 20 mil floor. So what that means is as values go up, tax rates go down, but they won't go below 20 mils. So we're at about 39 mils right now. They won't go below the 20 mils. There's over 400 school districts in the state that are at the 20 mil floor. So if I'm a district at a 20 mil floor, then if my values go up by 30%, my revenue is going up by 30%. We are not one of those districts, but there's over 400 districts in the state that are experiencing that, and people are rightfully losing their minds over their tax bills going up by 30% or whatever it is. And so that's the conversation that I think the state's focused on the most, is that 20 mil floor and what that looks like. But a lot of these districts are districts that haven't been on the ballot for years and years and years. And so it's a tough conversation to have right now, but I think that's why people are looking so closely at this, because of the way the values have changed.
yeah. Thank you for going through that, and she does have a great presentation, so everyone, I hear
If
that
you're ever
again.
interested,
If you're ever
please
interested.
reach
But I
out.
just think it's really important to understand, again, because people think, oh, I was reappraised, it went up, the schools are getting a lot more money, that's just not the case.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Hey, I thank you so much for that as well. If you don't mind, I want to take us back to slide 9 regarding the unstable state funding formula, because something that comes up a lot, at least certainly for me, is questions regarding enrollment. Are we seeing an increase? Are we seeing a decrease? Obviously, we know that the needs of our students just continue to skyrocket. Can you speak to us a little bit about enrollment, what we're actually seeing here in Westerville?
Yeah, so so we saw a slight drop in enrollment during COVID, and our enrollment overall has been relatively stable since. So our official enrollment number is the first week of October. We call it the October count. It's a whole thing that's been around forever. That's the number that we use as our official enrollment number. There's no shortage of enrollment numbers if you look on the Department of Education and Workforce's site. So we have the enrolled ADM here that we use as part of the payment reports, which only counts fractional amounts. We also have they use a weighted enrollment number, which counts students as more than one. So if they fall under some of these categories, they could count as much as 4 times a student. And so when you look at our overall weighted student number, we've seen growth in the specialized learning areas, that sort of those categorical add-ons that we're looking at here. And I do want to point out with this is a snapshot in time, and I know we talk about this, but this payment report is updated twice a month, and these numbers change on every payment report. So this is comparing our final payment reports for fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25, which is where we landed for the year. But if you look at these reports today, it won't look anything like some of this because it changes and shifts. So I'll be able to compare this data with June of 26 data once we get there. I just didn't have that for this current year to compare to. But yeah, it's, while our enrollment as a whole isn't changing significantly, the categories that students fall into for specialized learning has grown significantly over time.
So we're seeing growth, but we're seeing a decrease in investments at the state and at the federal level.
Yeah, as the state, I mean, our school funding model is designed that it is a shared responsibility between the state and the local community. And it is designed that as our community looks wealthier, the state picks up less and the local community picks up more. The problem with our unstable formula is that the state isn't updating those cost inputs. We just want them to look at, they've done lots of cost studies. All of these categories, special education, disadvantaged pupils, English learners, gifted, career tech, they have cost studies on every single one of these. They know how much it costs to educate. But all of these amounts, those dollar amounts are calculated on some arbitrary number that someone's come up with somewhere, not using the actual cost studies that they've done. And the same thing for base funding. They're just not using the cost studies that they've done.
And they're not using them because they've acknowledged they don't have the funding to fully fund that, so they're doing more of this residual funding.
Yeah.
So I have a point of clarity or clarification. I've heard from state lawmakers that schools, I'm saying schools, received more money this year than last in total. But when we define schools, we're defining not just public, but private and charter in the voucher system. So has the public schools received a larger share versus previous years, or is that all going to charter? Is it being divided equally? Are we receiving proportionally more or proportionally less?
Overall, total traditional public schools are receiving a little bit more, but it's like a little over 1% versus private schools are seeing a little over 9%. Charter schools are seeing, I think, close to 7%. So it's, if you're comparing it relative to the overall student population, no, it's not comparable. They're receiving significantly more. And there are several traditional public schools like ours that's seeing a decrease in state funding. And you're right, when they talk about historic investments in education, they're talking about their overall primary and secondary education budget, which includes chartered schools, private schools, JVSDs, like all of the things, along with traditional schools.
Something that we keep hearing about is, why Olentangy seems to be, doing this, and can you talk about what schools we're comparable to, actually, and why we're comparable to those schools rather than, like, the ones that are directly
Close to us?
Yeah.
So the Department of Education and Workforce has a similar district kind of list that they compare us to, and they compare us to districts based on student demographics that have the same sort of makeup as us. Sometimes it's not really based on geographical area, but just more like what do our how do our students show up to us every day? Olentangy is not on the list of similar districts, but the other thing I do want to say is if you look at Olentangy's expenditure per pupil, because this is one that keeps coming up, we are pretty close to them overall. If we look at the weighted per pupil amount, which is on the report card from the state, they're actually higher than we are. But if you look at the overall expenditure per pupil that doesn't weight students, I think we're just a little bit higher than they are. And so, but they are not a comparable district. And I also want to say when we're talking about state averages and, the funding formula and all that, it does not take into account geographical location for markets and things like that. We have healthcare costs for Central Ohio that we have to contend with. So do the other districts around us. But when we're comparing us to districts outside of Central Ohio, it's difficult to compare to as well. But yes, we're not comparable to Olentangy or New Albany or Upper Arlington or Bexley or any of those.
So the ones in our area that the state compares us to are typically Pickerington, Gahanna, Worthington, and Hilliard.
Yes.
We try to look at those a little more closely.
Thank you. And then I have one other question, just as a follow-up to what my colleague, Ms. Altman, asked about. And you had mentioned that during COVID, the county did these reappraisals and businesses had lost some value during COVID. So what happens when they go to the board and through those reappraisals and they found that they have lost some value? Do we have to pay that money back?
Yeah. Yeah, so normally if a property owner will file with the Board of Revisions, and we mostly just look at commercial property. If a property owner files with the Board of Revisions, there will be a hearing, a period of time. They pay their tax bill during that time. And so like one case that we're dealing with right now is a couple years out, I think 3 years actually. And it's a refund of about $730,000 back to the business. Because their value was adjusted appropriately so. They have, appraisals that they've had done and all of that. We've had attorneys take a look at it, and we are working on slowly phasing in the new value to help minimize the loss to the school district, which I appreciate them doing, but it's a significant, that's, $730,000 that's going back to the property owner, which it should, but it shouldn't have been collected in the first place. And those rates aren't going to be adjusted because of that, because of the timing, you know what I mean? So.
Thank you. So it just makes it a little bit harder to
Just one
have
more thing.
stabilization in our funding and forecasting, so.
And the other thing I'll say too is that the state of Ohio has made it significantly harder and added a lot more bureaucracy for us to even be able to pay attention to those property values. They just continue to make it harder and harder for us to be part of those conversations.
I don't know, Ms. Hamburg, maybe this is something for you to address, but when we talk about enrollment, right? One thing that, I hear is, well, if the enrollment went down, I'm just gonna make this up. If we lost 100 elementary school students, we should be able to cut 4 elementary classes, right? But the way we are constructed as a district, that's not how it works, because those students are spread across a lot of buildings. So can you just talk about how that works and how we pay attention to that?
Yes, thank you. So we have 15 elementary schools, so we actually lost between 600 and 700 total students across the district. We have 25 sites that actually have students. And so when you look at over 1,000 classrooms and you divide those students out, you're looking at less than 1 student per classroom. So if they were all concentrated in one area, then that would work. But when we're trying to spread them out over the entire geography of our district, it really doesn't result in a significant savings. Now, we do look every year, and we've had these conversations at previous meetings. We look at our enrollment every year, and sometimes we get late move-outs or late move-ins, and we have to make tweaks even after school starts. But we are looking every year to see, could we reduce a teacher at a grade level in this building? Do we need to add one at a grade level in this building? And we're constantly looking to balance that. And I'll just use elementary as an example because we have so many buildings. Having lots of small elementaries is a beautiful thing for culture for kids. There's lots of research around the type of environment that our staffs are able to create when it's a smaller school like that. That's the pro. The con is you're constantly trying to balance staffing across. So if you had just maybe 4 or 5 huge elementaries, it's really easy to adjust third grade staffing. But when you look at third grade across 15 buildings that have third grade, it becomes really challenging to maintain those ratios. So we don't see across 1,000 classrooms in the district huge changes. Where we're able to reduce a teacher because of enrollment decline, we certainly would do that. We don't keep them just to keep them, but it's challenging, and sometimes decreasing them would make the class sizes really, really big in that building, but keeping one makes them smaller than we would like. So we're constantly looking at that piece.
Thank you, because this is where different districts are different, right? You look at a district like New Albany where they have more of that sort of consolidated grade level schools, right?
They just have one building per grade
Right.
band. So they, all of their third grades in one school, so it's a lot easier to just say, we need one more third grade or we need one less versus we may need one more third grade teacher in 8 buildings. We may need one less third grade teacher in 3 buildings and the rest stay the same. So that's what we're constantly looking at. It's very different from like in New Albany, yes.
Thank you for talking that through.
One final question from me. When we've heard about unfunded mandates, things that pass through law that the school is required to then offer to its students and staff. Could you just give a few examples of what those look like and some things that have come down over the past 4 or 5 years that were expected by law now to do, both from an educational side and then how that affects staffing and things along those lines?
Yeah, so one example we gave when we were talking about the state budget was financial literacy. Like that was a new requirement that came down, and you know that was about $500,000 cost that we had to talk about. Science of reading, there was a lot of professional development and different things that went into that, and curriculum development and all of those. The one that I can think of, which is most recent, is the cell phone ban, right? Like that takes people and resources to make sure that kids don't have their cell phones during the school day.
I could speak to that even, and stopping in the buildings. There was one day where one of the high school assistant principals shared that she had taken 51 phones that day.
Yeah.
Hopefully, you know, that's settling down as kids are getting used to that, but those are the types of things that, you know, we all agree that less distractions on phones in the classroom is a wonderful thing. But then when we hear, well, why do you need so many assistant principals? Because they're also trying to do all their other jobs, take care of the discipline and evaluate teachers and manage the lunchroom and all the other things that they need to do. And now they're running around dealing with cell phones because it's a law. We don't have a choice. So that would be an example of, you don't think of a cell phone ban as having a cost to it, but it's definitely diverting resources from other things.
All right, thank you so much, Nicole.